In 1910, 12 ordinary men in Louisville, Kentucky, were handed a decision that has been argued over ever since. They had to decide who took the life of an 8-year-old girl. The man in front of them had been chased 11,000 miles across the world to reach that courtroom. The whole city was certain of his guilt. And by the end, those 12 men were certain too. They sent him away for the rest of his life. But here is the strange thing about their verdict. More than 100 years later, a great many people believe those 12 men convicted the wrong man entirely, that the real killer was never in that courtroom at all, that he was, in fact, among the most notorious murderers in American history, and that he was standing quietly in that same city the whole time, wearing a disguise no one would ever think to question. So I am going to do something a little different with this one. I am going to put you in that jury box. You will see the case exactly as those 12 men saw it, piece by piece. And then you will see the one thing they were never told, and at the end, you can decide for yourself. If a real, unsettled historical mystery is what you're here for, the subscribe button keeps them coming. Now let me hand you the first piece of evidence. It begins with a little girl and a cat in a window, the 8th of December 1909. A bitterly cold morning in Louisville. Alma Kellner was 8 years old, and before she is a case, before she is evidence, you should know her as she was. A bright, precocious child, a third-grade student at a girls' academy. One of the sisters who taught her remembered her as a child of great promise, gifted in her lessons, and warm and loving by nature. She came from a well-known family, too. The Kellners were part of Louisville's brewing world. Her grandfather was a brewer. Her family was tied by marriage to another of the city's great brewing names. This was old money and a respected name, the kind of family that had every resource and connection a family could have in that time and place. The kind whose child could not simply vanish without the entire city taking notice. The whole city noticed, and would not look away for the better part of a year. That morning, a little before 9 o'clock, Alma set out for morning mass. The church was St. John's, only 5 blocks from her home. It was a short, familiar walk through a neighborhood where everyone knew her face. And you have to understand the world she walked into, because it is nothing like ours. In 1909, small children moved through their own neighborhoods alone all the time. To school, to church. There were no phones, no alerts, no warnings about strangers. Instead, there was a street full of adults who knew every child by name, who waved and spoke to them every single day. A child walking alone was not a child in danger. She was watched over, quietly, by a dozen familiar faces. That was the quiet promise Alma's world ran on. A whole street of adults, watching over its children without ever being asked to. And that is exactly why what happened struck the city so hard. It did not just take a little girl. It broke a belief. It told every parent in Louisville that the old certainty, the idea that a child could walk to church alone in daylight and be perfectly safe, was a lie. If it could happen to Alma Kellner, on a familiar street, 5 blocks from home, then it could happen to anyone's child, anywhere. That was the safest thing in Alma's world, and it was about to fail her completely. As she neared the church, a druggist saw her through his shop window. She had stopped for a moment to play with a cat sitting in the glass. A small girl, on a freezing morning, saying hello to a cat. That is the last confirmed glimpse anyone ever had of Alma Kellner alive, a completely ordinary moment, the kind that happens on 1,000 streets on 1,000 mornings and is forgotten by lunchtime. Except this one was never forgotten, because it was the last. She walked on toward the church, and somewhere between that shop window and the altar, in a place she trusted completely, she vanished. That is the first piece of evidence. Hold on to it, because the distance between where she was last seen and where this story ends is almost nothing at all. And that is the detail that should trouble you most. When Alma did not come home, the search began fast, and the first theory was the obvious one for a family like hers. Kidnapping. Ransom. The Kellners had money. A wealthy family's child, snatched away, meant a demand for cash. So the whole city waited for the note, the call, the letter. Someone would make contact. No one ever did. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. And there was only silence. That silence is your second piece of evidence, because it quietly rules something out. A kidnapper who wants money reaches out. A kidnapper who never reaches out was never after money. Which means, from very early on, this was likely never a kidnapping for ransom at all. And if it was not about money, then it was about something far worse, and far harder for that grieving city to face. The search spread across the whole country. Reports came in from distant states, even from Canada. Everyone was chased. Everyone dissolved into nothing. Cranks and false sightings swarmed the case, as they always do, and each had to be run down and ruled out. For nearly 6 months, Alma's family lived in the cruelest state there is. Not grief exactly, because grief needs an ending. Just the waiting, the not knowing, hour after hour. Every promising lead lifted their hopes, and every dead end let them fall again. A girl matching her description, seen in a far-off town. A whisper, a rumor, a stranger's claim. Each one had to be checked. Each one came back empty. And with every empty answer, the family was left exactly where they started, staring at a front door that never opened. That is a particular kind of torture. There was no funeral to hold, no grave to visit, no place at all to set the grief down. Only the hope, thinning by the day, that a bright little girl might somehow still walk back through the door. And then, at the very end of May 1910, the waiting ended. Not because of a detective, or a tip, or a clever deduction, because of a leak. A water pipe had been quietly leaking in the basement of the church school for a long time. Nobody knew how long. The water had risen in that cellar until it stood 3 feet deep, dark and cold and still. So a plumber was sent down to find the broken pipe. He was looking for the source of the water. He found Alma Kellner instead. She had been there, in the cellar of the very church she had walked toward that December morning. Barely 100 yards from her own front door. For 6 months, a whole nation had searched, and she had never left the block. Every train station watched, every distant city checked, every far-off rumor chased, and the answer had been sitting in the dark, a stone's throw from her own bedroom window, the entire time. I will leave the details of that discovery unspoken, where they belong. What matters is your third piece of evidence, and it changes everything. Alma was not carried off to some far city. She was taken and hidden, right there, inside the building she trusted most. Which means her killer was almost certainly not a passing stranger. It was someone tied to that church, someone with keys, someone who could move through it freely, at any hour, and reach a flooded subcellar without a single person thinking twice. There is one more detail about that discovery that captures how strange this case is. It arrived on a day of celebration. Kentucky was dedicating its brand new state capitol building at that very time, a moment of pride and ceremony. And the governor himself had to step away from the festivities to deal with the horror of what a plumber had pulled out of a church cellar. The news went national overnight. In a single morning, the story flipped from a hunt for a lost child to a hunt for a killer. That realization narrowed the whole world of suspects down to a small circle, and one man in that circle had already done something that looked, to everyone, like an admission of guilt. He had run. His name was Joseph Wendling. He was a Frenchman, and he had been the janitor at St. John's, the caretaker, the man with the keys, who knew every corner of that building, including the corners no one else ever visited. And Joseph Wendling had quietly left Louisville around the middle of January 1910, about a month after Alma vanished. Months before her body was found. Sit with that sequence, because it is your fourth piece of evidence, and it is the heaviest one. The girl disappears in December. In January, the church janitor packs up and leaves the city. In May, the girl is found in the basement of that janitor's church. The instant her body was discovered, Joseph Wendling stopped being a former employee who had simply moved on. He became the most wanted man in the country. And there was a second thread pulling tight at the same time. Wendling's wife, Lena, had not gone with him. She had stayed in Louisville, working as the housekeeper for the pastor of that very church. When suspicion fell on her husband, she was placed under watch and pressed for anything she knew. The people closest to the vanished janitor were suddenly living under the eyes of the police. Something quietly strange sits in that arrangement itself. The suspect's own wife had been living and working inside the household of the church's pastor, at the very heart of the small world where the crime took place. Whatever she knew, or suspected, or feared about her missing husband, she now had to answer for. It is one more thread in a case where nearly everyone of interest orbited the same few doors of the same single church. But Wendling himself was gone, and so began one of the most extraordinary manhunts of its age. The pursuit fell to a determined Louisville police captain named John Carney. And what he did next reads more like an adventure novel than a police file. He did not sit and wait for his man to surface. He went after him, personally, across a continent, and then past it. Picture what that meant in 1910. No police radios, no shared databases. No photographs flashed across the country in an instant. A man who wanted to disappear into a nation of tens of millions had every advantage. He could change his name, change his story, melt into any crowd in any city. Carney chased him anyway, the slow and punishing way. Leads that were days or weeks old, trains across the country, telegrams sent and answered, strangers who thought they might have seen a Frenchman pass through. The scent lost, and found, and lost again. Every lead he chased was cold by the time he reached it. A sighting here. A rumor of a Frenchman there. He would travel for days on a single thread, only to find it frayed to nothing at the other end. Then he would pick up another and start again. It was pursuit by sheer stubbornness, one slow mile at a time, with none of the tools a modern detective would take for granted. That pursuit is said to have carried Carney some 11,000 miles in all, across the width of the United States, all the way to the West Coast, and even down into South America, chasing one man far beyond the borders of his own country. It is the kind of chase they would make a film about today. And it ended, finally, in San Francisco. On the far side of the country from that church cellar, Joseph Wendling was found and arrested. Then he was put on the long journey back to Kentucky to answer for the death of Alma Kellner. And Louisville breathed out. The monster was caught. The family, the church, the whole city could finally believe the man who did this was in a cell and would face justice. Now, this is the moment you have been waiting for. This is where you take your seat in the jury box. Because everything I have just told you is, more or less, the case the prosecution laid out. And when you look at it all stacked together, it is powerful. A girl vanishes inside a church. She is found hidden in that church's cellar. The one caretaker who knew every hidden corner of the building fled the city at exactly the wrong moment, and then he ran to the ends of the earth. Motive, means, opportunity, and flight. It fits. It fits almost perfectly. There is a reason you can weigh this the way that jury did, more than a century later. The full transcript of Wendling's trial, the actual record of what those 12 men heard, should have crumbled to dust long ago. Records like that are almost always lost, but by pure chance a copy survived, tucked away in a university archive, and was rediscovered generations later. Because of that one surviving document, we can still look at exactly what convinced 12 people to send a man away for life, and we can ask whether it should have. Before you hear anything else, on that alone, would you convict him? Before you answer too quickly, understand the weight that was pressing down on the real jury. A whole city was in mourning. A beloved child from a prominent family had been found hidden in a church. The story had been on front pages across the nation for the better part of a year, and the police had just spent an extraordinary effort chasing one man 11,000 miles around the globe to bring him to this room. Every force in that courtroom pointed one way. The city needed an answer. The city needed this to be over, and there sat the man who ran. That is not a neutral place to weigh evidence from. That is a place where the pressure to convict is almost unbearable. Most of that Louisville jury would have said yes without much hesitation, and they did. But before you settle, you need to notice the one word that quietly runs underneath every single piece of that case: circumstantial. Because here is what the prosecution did not have. No confession that settled it. No witness who saw him do it. No single, undeniable piece of proof that placed the crime beyond all argument. What they had was a pattern of suspicious facts, powerful in its shape, but every one of them open to more than one explanation. Take the strongest piece against him, the flight. He ran, and an innocent man does not run. That is the instinct, and it is a strong one. But flight is a slippery kind of proof. Frightened people run for all sorts of reasons. Think about who Wendling was: a foreigner, a caretaker, a man who knew that when a child was found in his church, the man with the keys would be blamed first and asked questions later. Such a man might flee precisely because he was innocent and terrified of exactly what was about to happen to him. Running makes a man look guilty. It does not prove that he is. Notice what you are actually doing when you convict on a pattern like this. You are not responding to proof. You are responding to a story that fits. A story where all the pieces line up so neatly that guilt feels obvious. But a story that fits is not the same as a fact that is proven. Some of the most certain-looking cases in history have fit perfectly and been completely wrong. Still, the jury weighed the pattern, and the pattern was heavy. They found Joseph Wendling guilty of the murder of Alma Kellner and sent him to prison for life. The case was closed. The city had its killer. Justice, it seemed, was done. And now I am going to show you the thing that jury was never told. The piece of evidence that was not in that courtroom. The one that has haunted this case for more than a century. There was another man in Louisville during those exact months, and no one in that trial ever looked at him, because at the time, he was the last person on earth anyone would suspect. His name was Hans Schmidt, and he was a Catholic priest. He also holds a distinction shared by no one else in the entire history of the United States. Hans Schmidt is the only priest ever to be executed in America, because Hans Schmidt was not truly a man of God. Not underneath the collar. He was a killer, cold and calculating, hiding inside the most trusted disguise a person could wear. A few years after his time in Louisville, in New York City, he took the life of a young woman named Anna Kellner. The case was so shocking it became one of the most infamous of the era. A murdering priest, unmasked in the largest city in the country. It is hard to imagine a betrayal of trust more complete. The case gripped the entire nation. A man of the cloth, the very symbol of trust and safety, revealed as something out of a nightmare. For that crime, he was tried, condemned, and put to death in the electric chair. No priest before him or since has ever met that end in the United States. That is the caliber of the man, not a rumor, not a wild theory. A documented, convicted, executed murderer who wore the robes of a priest. And here is the fact that should make the hair on your arms stand up. During the exact window when Alma Kellner vanished, Hans Schmidt was in Louisville. He was there from around August of 1909 until March of 1910, moving between the city's churches, present, unremarkable, and completely unsuspected, throughout the very period when a little girl disappeared from a church and was hidden in its cellar. Think about what a man like that had, that a janitor never could. A priest did not need to break in anywhere. A priest was welcomed, trusted on sight. A child, and a child's family, would trust him without a flicker of doubt. That trust was not a weakness in them. It was simply how the world worked. And it was exactly the kind of trust a predator in a collar could move through unquestioned. He had every reason in the world to be around churches, around the young, at any hour, and no one would ever question it, and no one did. Because in 1910, he was just a priest. The full weight of the investigation had already swung onto the janitor who ran. Nobody thought to look twice at the quiet clergyman moving through the same streets. So put yourself back in that jury box one final time, but now with the full picture. The picture the real jury never had. You have a man convicted entirely on circumstance, and you have a second man, later proven to be a man history would remember as one of its most dangerous killers. A man who was physically present in the right place, at the right time, in exactly the right disguise, while Alma Kellner died. Does your verdict still feel as certain as it did a few minutes ago? Now, to be fair, and this case demands fairness in every direction, the priest was eventually asked about it. Before his execution, Hans Schmidt denied any connection to the death of Alma Kellner. He said he did not do it. But weigh that denial for what it is worth. This was a proven liar, a proven killer, facing his own end. How much is the word of such a man really worth? You will have to decide that too. And the doubt cuts back the other way just as sharply. Wendling still ran. That never stops being a hard fact to explain. Maybe he fled out of pure innocent terror, or maybe he fled because he had something monstrous to flee from. The circumstantial case that convicted him was thin, yes. But thin is not the same as wrong. That is the trap of this case. Every path out of it leads to another question. Here is how it ended for the man in the dock. Joseph Wendling served a long stretch of his life sentence. Decades, inside a Kentucky prison. And then, after roughly 24 years, he was paroled. Released, he left the United States and sailed home to France, an old man by then, carrying whatever the truth actually was back across the ocean with him. That quiet ending contains the whole horror of the case in miniature. If he was guilty, then a child killer served his years and went home to grow old in peace. But if he was innocent, then an innocent man lost the heart of his life to a prison cell. Lost it for a crime committed by a priest who was put to death for someone else entirely. And the true killer of Alma Kellner was never punished for her at all. That is the cruelty of an unfinished case. A real jury, in a real courtroom, does not get to say we are not sure. They have to choose. Guilty or not guilty. They chose. And the moment they did, the search for the truth largely stopped, because as far as the law was concerned, the truth had been settled. But the law settling a question and the world actually knowing the answer are two very different things. More than a century later, there is still no way to know for certain which of those two stories is real. And that is what makes this one linger. It is not a tragedy with a clean ending. It is a tragedy wrapped inside a question that has never closed. An 8-year-old girl stopped to play with a cat on a freezing morning, walked into the safest place she knew, and was gone. A detective crossed the world to bring back one suspect. A jury convicted him on nothing but circumstance. And a second man, a genuine monster in a priest's collar, stood in the shadows of those same streets the whole time, unseen, unsuspected, and in the end, unaccountable. So the verdict, this time, is yours. You have sat in the jury box. You have seen the case they saw, and the one crucial thing they did not. The janitor who ran, or the priest who was there all along. Which way do you vote? Tell me down in the comments, and tell me why. After more than 100 years, an honest verdict is the only kind anyone can still give. And a little girl who stopped to pet a cat on a cold December morning still deserves one. So cast yours. I read every single one.